Good. So now we start. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from one side of the world to the other. I'm really thrilled and excited to host this online conference today, attended by a truly international audience and with the participation of such distinguished chairs and speakers. My name is Augusto Preta. I'm the chairman of the IIC Italian chapter, hosting with the AGICOM, the Italian Communication Authority, this webinar. Before giving the floor to the following speaker, just allow me to say a few words on the topic of today's topics. One of the most common assumptions in the policy world is the idea that where network effects, network externalities do exist, there is a need for regulation. In reality, it is true that when we have network externalities, regulation must certainly keep an eye on them, since externalities reduce economic efficiency and in many cases produce negative effect on the consumer welfare. But it's equally true that not all the externalities produce negative effects and sometimes, on the contrary, produce positive ones. Typically, in the former case, the regulator must intervene to reduce inefficiencies and restore market dynamics, while in the latter, the regulator should be aware of the best things to do is to step aside. Since, however, in the real world, there are not such school cases, all black and white, it is clear that when we deal with those issues, at the end of the day, we can convene that in the presence of network effects, regulation is necessary, but the key issues, the key point becomes at this point balancing. In addition, when we deal with the platform, digital platform in our case, this issue becomes more and more complicated because we are talking of indirect network effects. Like in the multi-sided markets, where the platform internalized the externalities between the two sides of the economic relationship, here the benefit lies in the fact that these people wouldn't have maximized their utilities if the platform had not put them in contact, having failed to relate to each other or relating less effectively. We can call them positive effects. On the other hand, however, precisely because of the peculiarity of their strategic position, this same platform can practice anti-competitive behavior, imposing price and reducing the possibility for other competitors to enter this market. That's the negative aspects. So again, the regulators must find the right balance. And finally, we are faced with cases that are often not dealt with, such as those we are discussing today, namely unintended positive network externalities. In this case, however, the strict regulation that in the analysis of direct externalities can lead to a reduction in the freedom of the platform to operate, must consider the further consequences of preventing these unexpected positive effects in the future, and therefore reducing even more the social benefit and the drive for innovation. With all this in mind, this joint event of the IIC Italy chapter, the AGICOM, today aims to explore the benefit produced by the rise of online platforms on the digital ecosystem beyond the consolidated business model and commercial relationship. In this respect, it's crucial to recognize platform complexities and their double-sided nature. On the one hand, one platform raises concern. On the other hand, the benefit of the service, both for the individual and for the community, are undeniable. Therefore, in a time where negative effects are mostly highlighted and strongly scrutinized in both sides of the Atlantic, we think the positive aspects of online platforms should also take into account to reach a truly balanced, forward-looking regulation. This is why I think our conference today is so relevant and topical. With all this in mind, I had to give the floor now, according to the original program, to the AGCOM president, Giacomo La Sorella, but he's not here with us today for a very strong reason the Commissioner Elisa Giommi will explain in a moment. That's give me, on the other hand, the opportunity to introduce Elisa, AGCOM Commissioner and board representative in the Italy chapter, in the Italian chapter of the IIC. She has been the master, the true fuel and engine of the entire event. Without his inexhaustible energy and enthusiasm, such an impressive, well-attended event would not have taken place. Thanking Elisa for her strong commitment and achievement, I wish you all a very fruitful day's work. I will follow it with great curiosity and interest, and with the regret that I guess I share with many of you, of not being able to join all the parallel sessions at the same time. But now the time has come to step aside. Elisa, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Augusto. Thank you. You are very kind. Actually, nothing would have been possible without your support. So thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, even though, as Augusto was mentioning, the pleasure that we feel in hosting this conference has been overshadowed by the sad death of Enrico Mandelli, our colleague and member of the AGCOM board, last week. So we dedicate this conference to his memory. We want to remember him as someone who was very devoted to his work and was very generous and authentic, I would say, in everything that he did. Our president, Giacomo La Sorella, who was due to speak before me, is unable to be here today just because he is with Enrico's family in this moment in northern Italy. President La Sorella is sad not to be here. He sends you his warm regards and thank you, all of you, for the valuable contribution that you will bring to the conference. Now, before briefly setting the scene, I would like to thank IIC. I would like to thank AGCOM, European Union Relations and International Activities and Services, and especially I would like to thank Antonello De Tommaso and Francesco Sciacchitano, who are known to most of you. I would like to thank my staff and especially Andrea Giulia Monteleone. And finally, a special thanks to our panel chairs who have been doing such an amazing job. Thank you, Céline Craig, Scott Marcus, François Fournemont, and Marco Pierani. Okay, this conference, as you know, is dedicated to online platforms, an issue whose visibility has been increasing dramatically, I would say, in recent years. Just to provide a little illustration of this, consider that the number of articles related to platforms in the Italian printed and online press jumped from 286 in November 2020 to 543 in November 2021. So more than doubled in the space of a year. I remain unconvinced, however, that this increase in visibility is not paralleled by the development of a mature and balanced approach to platforms. More precisely, I have the feeling that public opinion is somehow stuck in the same binary logic we find in debates on practically every issue today. In other words, when talking about platforms, Only two polarized and opposite alternatives seem to be available, like or unlike, good or bad, dangerous or beneficial. Nuance is lost within this logic, and when nuance is lost, we all lose out. More precisely, in my view, the entire evolution of the debate on platforms has been characterized by two major and opposite phases. The first one, I would say, was an enthusiastic phase and lasted up until a few years ago. A phase where platforms were celebrated as drivers of technological innovation, participatory economy, participatory culture. The argument being that platforms empowered people because they allowed individuals to offer products and services directly to consumers, bypassing corporate or state intermediaries and unnecessary expenses. This matrix, it is worth highlighting, also characterized the regulatory interventions of the early 2000s. The e-commerce directive, for example, the US safe harbor doctrine, all of them aiming at making only those who use platforms responsible. Second phase of the public debate on platforms is characterized by the rise of negative feelings. And I believe that it's not only my thesis, of course, this can be put down, the rise of negative feelings, to two different processes. The first one is a material process, so to speak, whereas the second one is a symbolic process, a word that sociologists like very much. As to the material process, I guess that the participatory economy utopia started to vanish as people realized that the internet, which was supposed to be the most democratic of the space, had been undergoing a process of concentration without a precedent, leading to the constitution of 5 monopolies called GAFA. Now, we know that the word monopoly is automatically synonymous with danger, irrespective of if these monopolies are efficient and do not behave anti-competitively. The second process that has shown a negative light on platforms has its origin in events like the previous one and like all social processes, but it entails consequences that are more relevant at the symbolic level. This is why I was talking about the symbolic process. And this process is kind of set up in motion by a series of events that fall between the Cambridge Analytica scandals in 2016 and the events on Capitol Hill last January. All of these, of course, have generated concern for the institutions of representative democracy and citizenship rights at large. At the same time, I would say, we have witnessed a growth in the concern about minors because of suicides blamed on TikTok challenges and because of research evidence that are becoming more and more available, showing young people's growing anxiety and unease about their body image and their social image on Instagrams and other platforms. And this is becoming a real issue. Turning to more recent events, I'd like to mention that in her report to the US Congress, Frances Hogan, former Facebook product manager and now the whistleblower behind the Facebook Papers scandals, Hogan also focused on the harm caused to children. She did also another thing, which is very interesting in this context. She compared the Facebook platforms to the tobacco multinationals that make addictive and toxic substances available. As a media scholar, I am struck that this is precisely the same metaphor underpinning the first theory that was developed 100 years ago to explain the effects of media, which at that time were cinema, radio, and the printed press. That was the so-called hypodermic needle theory, which compared the messages of the media to substances penetrating our skin, manipulating the will of individuals, or causing addiction. I am going towards the conclusion to pin down a concept that is quite relevant in my view. As a media scholar, once again, I find noteworthy that every technological innovation has been accompanied by the same moral panic, I would say, about technology ripping away human agency. This is also the kernel of the contemporary anti-platform rhetoric that is pervading large areas of public discourse and resonating in the many contemporary TV series. Why do I mention TV series? Because I am a TV scholar, actually, and I consider TV series as anthropological documents in their own rights. When people study our civilization in 1,000 years, they will be impressed by the amount of globally circulating TV series and movie, especially those produced by SVODs, which is interesting, the amount of TV series and production that target services offered by online platforms such as dating apps, wider apps, marketplace, social networks. All these series and movies share a stigmatization of the constitutive elements of platforms, especially of those platforms like Facebook or Google, whose technological architecture and business model are based on data collection and profiling. All of these are depicted in TV series and movies as deceitful or as working against human interest and authentic desires and needs and choices. And it is striking how this fictional storytelling resonates with the thesis shared by some scholars that see the rise of digital platforms as the final accomplishment of capitalism's aim of neutralizing the unpredictable variable represented by humans, freeing itself from the unruly workers thanks to automatization of labor process, and freeing itself from unruly desires thanks to prediction and recommendation systems based on algorithms. Now, this type of storytelling has become so widespread that it goes beyond the boundaries of dystopian sci-fi and contributes a lot to the collective feelings of hostility towards platforms. Let me be clear, of course, I am not arguing that platforms are just a variation on the theme of previous media, nor do I intend to minimize their impact, which is largely unknown yet. The novelty of platform, in fact, is demonstrated by the fact that in scientific literature, no one has ever talked about the mediatization of society as a whole. We have talked about mediatization of politics. We have talked about mediatization of democracy, television being the main reference in this. On the contrary, nowadays we speak of the platformization of society as a whole, and this is very relevant. Platformization is a term that, as you know, was introduced in 2018 by Van Dijk and her colleagues. And today, if you Google on Google Scholar, just to talk about platform, the term platformization, you get something like 4,200 citations. Such a quantity means that these terms captures a broad phenomenon, captures a new paradigm. We no longer speak of the role or the impact of platforms on society. We speak about platformization of a society as if platforms and society were no longer separate entities. In fact, platformization, just to complete this line of reasoning, means that the gradually infiltrating and converging with the offline institution and practices through which democratic societies are organized. The term platformization, and this is the last block before concluding, the term platformization in the approach of those who created it also refers to the dispute, to the profound dispute about private gain versus public benefit. I like to think that collectively we can find ways to transform this dispute between private gain and public interest into a synergy, or at least into an interaction of values that are no longer mutually exclusive. And it is precisely to find this way that all the conference panels triangulate regulators, big tech representatives, and academics. We thought, when thinking about the conference concept, that a possible way to rework the dispute into a virtuous interaction was to elaborate more on the public benefit pole, that is, acknowledging the advantages brought about by platforms that are so widespread and pervading that today we tend to take them for granted. This is why the conference encompasses 4 different panels exploring the notion of benefit in relation to different dimensions of collective life, ranging from economics to culture and democratic institutions. Finally, we believe that a good way to acknowledge the platform's public benefits is having all these brilliant and sounding speakers engaged in a sort of cognitive exercise, a sort of lateral thinking exercise aimed at identifying indirect benefits, by which we mean those positive outcomes that were not expected or intentionally sought, but which nonetheless derived from the massive diffusion of the online services offered by platforms. Serendipity, let me be inspirational, that is finding something while looking for something else, is in fact certainly an index of the ability to innovate and move towards the horizon of the possible. And certainly shifting the horizon of possibility also requires a holistic approach. This approach characterized precisely the splendid collection edited by Professor Damian Tambini who is, like all of us, a fervent supporter of the need to regulate. And those analyses can provide, in our view, many insights for a balanced regulation, as in the title of the conference. So before leaving the floor to my colleague, I'd like to briefly introduce him by saying that Damian Tambini is an associate professor at the Department of Media and Communication at the London School of Economics and program director for the Media and Communication. Professor Tambini is known to most of you. He's an expert in media and communication, regulation and policy, and is active in policy making as well as academic research. I just want to mention that the last collection he edited, Regulating Big Tech, was preceded by another very interesting book, which was called The Digital Dominance, the Power of Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. I'm really happy that Professor Tambini is here today with us. I leave him the floor, and once again, thank you all for coming. I hope this conference will be interesting. I'm sure that it will be. Thank you to your contribution.
Thank you, Elisa, and thanks also to the IIC and AGICOM. It's a great pleasure to be speaking. I'm a long-time supporter of the IIC. It's an organization that is able to bring together something which I think is really needed. People who are pragmatic, they are involved in promoting the use of innovative approaches to regulation in the public good, and they work across academia and regulation in a way which I think is unique. I'm going to just, if I can just share my screen here, I'm going to speak about not only the two books that were mentioned in the introduction. I'm going to speak about another book which has recently been published just a couple of months ago on media freedom that links together a lot of my thinking in this area. So along with the two books that were mentioned, which are really collections of views of colleagues together with some overarching reflections on what I think are the big issues in relation to regulation and policy. And I'm going to make a plea to regulators, to experts like the audience today who are involved in media and communications regulation. And the plea is that I think regulators need to rediscover their democratic mission. I'm going to describe some ways in which I think regulation is in a process of flux, and we're seeing new forms of regulation and new structures of regulation emerging. And regulators have always been, although sometimes they present themselves as, if you like, faceless bureaucrats, I would argue that they've always been one of the key institutions to protect democracy and civil society. And as democracy is in crisis in Europe and around the world, the role of communications regulators, I would argue, is to help ensure that democratic communication systems do not become authoritarian, that populist fragmentation does not proceed. And in order to do that, I think it's useful from time to time for us to reflect on really the fundamentals. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the reasons why, as Elisa mentioned in her introduction, there are some big paradigm shifts going on in regulation. And I'll also say a little bit about the new frameworks that are emerging that regulators like AGICOM will be implementing in all likelihood in coming years. And I want to just, through describing those examples, show why I think regulators need to perhaps be a little bit more aware and active in communicating their important democratic role, in addition to some of the economic regulation, consumer interest-oriented role, which Augusto in his eloquent introduction also highlighted. So in doing this, I'm going to cover the books I mentioned, but also a few reports. I've done a series of reports for the Council of Europe, and in particular, one which is leading to a new Council of Europe instrument that I want to highlight, which has just been approved by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and that is a recommendation on new principles for media and communication governance that I think are highly relevant to our discussion today. So, and just to mention that I'm also looking at the media law aspect of this reconfiguring of what I call the privileges that apply to media, as well as the obligations that apply to media. And I argue that the reconfiguration in regulation can be construed as, if you like, a new deal, a new social contract for the media. And that's one of the central arguments for the book, and one which I have argued that it has, I think somebody has their mic on, they maybe want to mute themselves. So, back to basics. I think most people will have heard of the German sociologist and philosopher Jurgen Habermas, but he expresses, if you like, what's fundamentally at stake in liberal democracies that we all too often forget. And that is that in liberal democracies, as Elisa alluded, the legitimacy of the system is based on individual actors making free choices. And the reason that communication governance matters is because precisely, and we've seen this at multiple periods in history, if the autonomous human agency or any citizen, citizens who've been targeted by messages, if that autonomous human agency is compromised, then the legitimacy of the system breaks down. Equally, if the public sphere system of opinion distribution in society is in some way regulated or controlled, this also can be fatal to legitimacy of the system. And we see that in mid-20th century authoritarianism in ways that I don't have to repeat here. But we all, I would argue, need to keep in mind. I would argue that we need to keep these fundamentals in mind during what I've described as a process of flux in regulation. Now, why is regulation in flux? I'm not going to go into too much detail. These are arguments that are familiar, but I'm going to mention quickly three reasons. First of all, in competition, and I agree with the pragmatic points that Augusto made in his introduction, but we're seeing big changes in how we approach competition in platform markets. So in the first edition of Digital Dominance, the book that was referred to, there's a really useful chapter by Patrick Barwise and others, and he describes why the normal operation of competition doesn't seem to deal with dominance effects in platform markets. And this may have to do with network externalities, and it may have to do with various forms of consumer lock-in and the features of multi-sided markets. But there is a sense that platform markets in particular have triggered a reassessment of competition, and even a paradigm shift in theorizing in antitrust regulation. So a measure of that, I think in global terms, is that Lina Khan, one of the leading theorists, has recently been appointed by Biden as chair of the Federal Trade Commission. And you'll notice also that Lina Khan has a chapter in that book, Digital Dominance. And in that chapter, she describes how Chicago school approaches to antitrust, particularly those that stress price as a metric or an indicator of consumer interests, really don't get to grips with some of the underlying harms and externalities and dominance effects associated with platforms. And she gives the example of Amazon. So competition regulation is being rethought. The question of whether certain harms, and the term addiction was used previously, certain harms may not be dealt with by the usual operation of the market, is being, I would argue, grappled with alongside that debate about the role of competition. Second reason that I would mention alongside competition is national security. So in the broadcasting age, we had a particular settlement on freedom of expression and justified restriction under the European Convention of Free Speech is justified for national security reasons, if they are proportionate and necessary. But we've seen, and I won't rehearse the arguments, allegations, and whether or not we argue that these are real effects, whether elections have really effectively and successfully been interfered with by foreign powers, it's been established that this is theoretically possible, that there are active measures being operated by powers outside Europe, and that if you look at the way the bodies like NATO and others have responded, cyber and information warfare changes the game, and there are implications for communications regulation, and also potentially damaging implications, for example, in arguments for a more censorious regime, for example, controlling so-called fake news, and new roles for regulators in controlling bad actors or external influences. So the second reason I think we're seeing a paradigm shift in regulation is this question of national security. And the third and unrelated one is, of course, democracy itself. It is worth mentioning and worth recalling that the new Digital Services Act and also the Digital Markets Act, currently being discussed in the European Parliament, was preceded by the Democracy Action Plan. So those of us who are old enough to remember the 1990s and the first settlement on internet regulation, that was all about economic growth and innovation. This paradigm shift in communication and media governance is about democracy. So it's about democracy and it's about fundamental rights. And this is reflected in the texts and in the implementation of them. So those three big changes change the balance in regulation. And we can think of this in theoretical terms in a way that different, in my experience, as a person who is either, I consider myself neither a lawyer nor an economist, or maybe I'm both. There are economistic approaches to regulation which tend to stress the consumer interest as a proxy of the public interest or the sum of consumer interests. And there are legal and lawyerly approaches to regulation that stress standards established by parliaments being implemented through regulation. And the balance between those is also shifting at the highest level. So what can be achieved and what can be left to the market, achieved through the operation of the market, and what can be left to the market is being reassessed, given those quite fundamental challenges to the paradigm, which are presented by platform markets in communication. So if those are the reasons that communication regulation is changing, let's speak for a short while about what's coming down the pipe. What is going to be implemented in coming years, most likely by Agicom in Italy and the NRAs elsewhere in Europe, or by bodies described in the Digital Services Act as the digital service coordinators. So the scope of the Digital Services Act, as I'm sure people will be aware, but I think it's worth just rehearsing the argument. The scope establishes 4 categories of service providers. I've nicked this graphic, by the way, from your colleagues at Ofcom. The 4 categories have a sliding scale of obligations on the principle that very large online platforms have a particular impact on the public, and it's justified in placing stronger obligations on them. So the categories are intermediary services, which is the wider category of all service providers hosting services, platforms, and the so-called VLOPs, or very large online platforms. These have, and I hope that's visible, I'll mention it, I'm sure you're familiar with this. These different categories of service providers in the new regime will have a variety of obligations. So we can see that very large online platforms will have additional obligations, for example, with, and this is where the particular specificity of the new regime comes into play. Very large online platforms will be asked under the new regime, which is similar to the concept which is being developed in the UK of a duty of care. They will have obligations to conduct risk assessments in relation to their services, in relation to, for example, the likelihood that they may be distributing illegal content, or that there may be other negative consequences of their services, including, for example, risks to fundamental rights under Article 26, and risk to civic discourse. Obviously, these are big and contested categories, but this is quite a broad duty on the platform to monitor risks. So we can see in relation to those kinds of obligations, for example, what is happening will potentially be a shift from certain categories that have traditionally been dealt with through voluntary self-regulation into a co-regulatory structure. So many people will be aware that since the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which Elisa mentioned in the introduction, and since some of these problems for democracy and foreign interference have been at the top of people's minds in many European countries, the service providers have been helped by the European Commission in what is essentially a voluntary process to come up with a code of practice on disinformation. Now, whilst the Digital Services Act doesn't place a formal obligation on the platform operators to implement this code, where it will come into the schema is in likelihood in relation to this framework for risk assessments, and also the obligation to mitigate any risk that service providers identify in their services. And that is their services, not just in terms of the content they're hosting, but also the recommendation systems. So that is an example of how this new regime will shift. You can see from the graphic that it contains also obligations, for example, in terms of transparency reporting, partly as a safeguard for any chilling effect that these forms of regulatory practice might have on speech. There are obligations on the larger platforms to cooperate with trusted flaggers, and that is formalizing, again, essentially voluntary processes that have a particular trusted flaggers have particular expertise for example, monitoring the prevalence of particular forms of illegal content, and that might be content that is harmful to children, which meets the legal threshold, or it might be content that is meets definitions of hate speech, for example, or terrorism content. So those trusted flaggers are no longer simply a voluntary scheme. Under the new regime, they will be there will be a list of trusted flaggers which is maintained at the national level, which is shared with a newly established Europe-wide board representing the digital services coordinators. So I'm sure others will have views. I'm not going to rehearse the whole framework, but I'm going to just give some comments on it, just some points for which I think are points for discussion. One is to mention that I would say that all of this has to be seen in the context of the Digital Markets Act, the partner piece of legislation as part of the overall package, and that a lot of the debates and concerns about this new form of complex co-regulation of speech, of illegal speech, and of harmful speech. One of those concerns also depend on the market structure. And I think regulators, policymakers need to keep in mind what kind of outcome they would like to see. Implementing a structure like this obviously raises the barriers to entry, and it may be that the investment in moderation, which is necessary to comply with these new kinds of duties, is possible only by one or two of these already dominant companies in the search and social space. So there must be ongoing monitoring of that market structure. And we also should think about what kind of outcome we need. And I would argue, and I've argued in various pieces of writing, that consumers should be able, when it comes to content which is viewed as harmful but not illegal, to switch between platforms according to their own risk assessments. And they should be able, in a fully functioning market, to do so on the basis of good information and using the ability to port data, and switching costs should be kept low. And I would argue that it's going to take a long time to get to that, but we do need to monitor and review market structure and the state of overall competition. Second comment, I would say, in relation to risk assessments and mitigation, is that all of this can result in a chilling effect and problems of private censorship. We do need to move towards a framework which is also aware of the positive role of these kinds of measures, and the role of traditional media or quality media or trusted journalism is going to be increasingly important. For example, in terms of whether it is privileged within the scheme. There is a debate about whether there should be a media exemption from the risk assessment duties for ethical, trusted media, perhaps that meet some other kind of self-regulatory standard. And there are also questions around whether in mitigating risk, platforms might provide prominence for particular kinds of trusted journalism. So the European Broadcasting Union and the Reporters Without Borders are currently developing a framework for the Journalism Trust Initiative, which will be a way of flagging and tagging trusted journalism, and in ways that platform could potentially prioritize it in recommendation and search results, for example. So risk mitigation can also be a way of developing this positive role. A key aspect, which I'm sure will appeal to all those regulators on this call, is the question of regulatory independence. And this is something I think we need to keep in a laser-like focus. The draft Digital Services Act contains a very strong protection of the independence from government interference and also from the regulatees of the digital services coordinators, and that should be protected. It's extremely important that they act with complete independence, and that's something obviously the United Kingdom is not within this framework. It's decided in its wisdom to take its own path, but it's come up with a framework which really has insufficient independence of Ofcom in its performance of duty of care regulation under the Online Safety Bill, which Parliament is currently discussing. So independence is a absolutely fundamental part of this, and it needs to be protected very carefully and implemented in an undiluted form. So I'm going to just move towards a conclusion and hopefully invite some questions of participants. This building is in fact the library of the University of London, and I'm speaking to you from London School of Economics, which is part of the University of London. It is also the first result that comes up if you Google image search for the Ministry of Truth. So the reason I'm showing it to you now is that obviously we have to keep in mind that this new regime and these new forms of complex co-regulation constitute new institutions and frameworks for controlling speech. And particularly in the era of conspiracy theories, the overarching concern I have is that such a regime of speech control, whether or not it's involving different private actors, public actors, standards set by parliaments, the involvement of independent regulators such as AGCOM, if it is to be effective in protecting democracy, and that after all is the objective, it has to be trusted. And I would say not trusted despite its faults, but it has to be trusted, it has to be subject to due trust. It had to be it has to be deserving of trust. So the challenges, I would argue, in coming up with a framework for implementing the Digital Services Act, and in whatever form it eventually reaches, along with a number of other new innovations and settlements which are necessary in relation to prioritization of public interest content, in relation to new forms of self-regulation and reduction of various harms. Whatever that complex co-regulation framework is, there is a task which I would argue needs to begin immediately, of raising public awareness, raising public media literacy, and developing due trust in this process. Because if media freedom is genuine, we really need to understand whether the media are free from the state, to what extent, under what conditions, with what obligations, with what responsibilities. And I firmly believe that that's not something which should be restricted to the towers of academia or the corridors of regulators. This is something that has to be more widely understood, and it has to be presented in a way which is compelling and simple enough for people to be able to grasp. And that's why in the final book that I mentioned, I've been arguing for a new understanding of media freedom, and one that is genuinely European and is quite different to the US First Amendment approach, which is that approach which is adopted by the platforms themselves. I'm going to stop there, and I'm available for questions. Thanks very much for your attention.
Of course, I just wanted to thank Professor Tambini. I'm sorry that the time is over, but I'm sure that some of the insights he gave will be picked up in parallel session. And for example, I do not resist. I have to make a very short comment. I was impressed by many of the things you said, but I think that your idea of mitigation of risk as possible positive measures, very interesting. And the example you provided are very interesting when you referred to the initiative developed by EU Broadcasting and also Journalism Association in order to develop a sort of a trusted journalism system and flagging system as well. And I would be very curious to know what are the risks for the independency of journalism today. And I know it is a very broad question, but it is a sort of insight for parallel session based on your speech. My question is, are the major risks to for the independency of journalism today, are they posed by political or economic power, or is there a coincidence? Big issue, I know, but if you want to give just a quick reply on this.
It is a big question, and I'm sure others are keen to speak. Sorry if I spoke for too long.
Don't worry.
Journalism needs positive support. That's clear. The business model has broken down. There are various forms of negotiation with platforms, both in terms of the revenue split and the data split, and various forms of bargaining in which media interests are the weaker party because of the competitive dynamics. Obviously, in that situation, there is a policy discussion going on, and regulation is necessary, and Digital Services Act is really a big part of it. We'll also see at the European level discussions of a Media Freedom Act, which is also being discussed. And in that, if you like, what I call in my book that the New Deal for journalism, there are always possibilities of reciprocities, deal making, and problems in the relationship between the so-called independent fourth estate and particular political interests. And that's something that civil society organizations and experts need to watch very, very carefully. There are multiple dangers of capture. I think capture by the platforms themselves is a big part of it. But if you look at what's happening in Hungary and Poland, for example, currently, there are some lessons that need to be learned. The danger of state interference is always there, it's always changing, and it almost always combines some sort of state and private bodies. But it's only really civil society and effective protection through law and regulation can deal with that.
Thank you, Damien. I wish we had more time to talk, but thank you so much for your contribution and also for the reply to this very big issue I raised in the end. Okay, the floor now to the parallel session, and see you later. Thank you again, Damien.